The nightmares always started the same way. Marcus Rivera would be back in the Humvee, dust swirling outside the reinforced windows, the taste of metal and fear thick in his mouth. The radio crackled with reports of IED activity ahead. But the convoy had to keep moving. Supply runs couldn't wait for perfect conditions in Afghanistan. Nothing could. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. Then came the flash of light, the world turning sideways, the sensation of flying through air that suddenly felt thick as water. After that, just darkness and the distant sound of someone screaming his name. Marcus woke on his mattress on the floor of his studio apartment in Portland, sheets soaked with sweat, his left leg throbbing with phantom pain from shrapnel that army surgeons had removed 2 years ago. The digital clock beside his bed read 3:47 a.m. Another sleepless night in a string of sleepless nights that stretched back to his medical discharge. He limped to the kitchenette and shook 2 pills from a prescription bottle, washing them down with lukewarm coffee from the pot he'd made 6 hours earlier. The pain medication helped with his leg, but it did nothing for the other wounds, the ones that couldn't be seen on X-rays or treated with surgery. Through his apartment window, Portland's empty streets stretched beneath flickering street lights. Most people were asleep, dreaming ordinary dreams about ordinary problems. Marcus envied them that simple peace, the ability to close their eyes without seeing convoy routes and blast patterns, without hearing the voices of friends who hadn't made it home. At 34, he felt ancient. 3 tours in Afghanistan had carved lines into his face that belonged on someone twice his age. His dark hair was already showing gray at the temples. His hands, once steady enough to disarm improvised explosives, now shook when he tried to drink coffee without the medication. The VA had been trying to help, but their version of help felt more like processing damaged goods than healing human beings. Weekly therapy sessions where he sat in circles with other broken veterans, everyone encouraged to share their feelings with counselors who'd never heard a shot fired in anger. Group activities designed to reintegrate them into civilian society, as if civilian society had any use for men trained to kill efficiently and follow orders without question. Dr. Sarah Chen, his latest VA therapist, had been gently suggesting that Marcus might benefit from a more structured environment. Translation: they wanted to commit him, lock him away with other veterans who'd come home carrying too much darkness. The evaluation was scheduled for next month, and Marcus knew he probably wouldn't pass it. His answers to their questionnaires were too honest, his dreams too violent, his isolation too complete. He'd been living in the studio apartment for 8 months, ever since his last job had ended badly. He'd been working construction, but the sound of nail guns too closely resembled automatic weapons fire. Panic attacks on job sites weren't good for construction careers. Neither were the times when he'd hit the ground at the sound of car backfires, or the afternoon he'd tackled a coworker who'd approached him from behind without warning. The disability checks from the VA covered his rent and basic expenses, but barely. He ate a lot of canned soup and peanut butter sandwiches, shopped for clothes at thrift stores, and hadn't owned a car since selling his pickup truck to pay for his father's funeral 6 months ago. His world had shrunk to a few city blocks. The apartment, the corner grocery store, the library, where he could use free internet, and the VA clinic where they monitored his steady decline toward complete mental collapse. Marcus made fresh coffee and opened his laptop. Another donation from the VA's Veteran Reintegration Program. The screen's blue glow lit his hollow cheeks and tired eyes as he scrolled aimlessly through news websites, social media feeds full of other people's lives, job listings for positions he wasn't qualified for or mentally capable of handling. He wasn't sure what made him click on the real estate website. Maybe desperation, maybe boredom, maybe the fantasy of escape that haunted every veteran who'd ever stared at apartment walls and wondered if this was all that remained of their life. The search filters were set to under $5,000, which eliminated most of the listings. What remained were mobile homes in bad neighborhoods, empty lots in towns he'd never heard of, and foreclosed properties that banks wanted to dump quickly. That's when he saw it. Historic lighthouse for sale. Morrison Point, Maine. As-is condition. Serious structural issues. No utilities. Access road needs repair. Starting bid. $1. $1. Marcus stared at the listing for a long time, certain it was a mistake or a scam. Nobody sold lighthouses for $1, even broken ones. But the listing appeared legitimate, posted by the state of Maine, complete with official disclaimers about environmental hazards, structural problems, and the buyer's responsibility for all renovation costs. The photographs showed a white tower rising from rocky coastal bluffs, its paint peeling like sunburned skin. The lighthouse looked like Marcus felt weathered, damaged, abandoned by a world that had moved on to newer and better alternatives. Built in 1892, the description read, it had guided ships safely to harbor for decades before being decommissioned in 1978, when modern navigation made it obsolete. Marcus read the listing 3 times before allowing himself to believe it might be real. The lighthouse came with 2 acres of rocky coastline and the remnants of a keeper's cottage. The property had been abandoned for over 40 years, left to deteriorate while lawyers argued about environmental liability and maintenance costs. Now the state just wanted someone to take responsibility for it, even if that someone paid only a symbolic $1. He researched Morrison Point online, finding scattered references to shipwrecks, local folklore, and a lighthouse keeper named Samuel Morrison, who disappeared mysteriously in 1898. The town nearest to the lighthouse was Prospect Harbor. Population 812, according to the last census. Remote, isolated, forgotten, exactly the kind of place where a broken veteran might disappear without anyone noticing or caring. Marcus stared out his apartment window at the Portland streets, imagining instead the view from a lighthouse tower. Endless ocean, infinite sky, waves crashing against rocks instead of traffic grinding past his windows. A place where the only explosions were waves hitting stone, where the only voices calling his name were seagulls and wind. The rational part of his mind listed all the reasons this was a terrible idea. He had no money for renovation, no experience with historic preservation, no idea how to live without electricity or running water. The property was hundreds of miles from the nearest VA facility. If he had another breakdown, there would be no help available, no support system, no safety net. But the other part of his mind, the part that had volunteered for military service, that had signed up for dangerous missions, that had always chosen the harder path when easier alternatives existed, whispered something different. Maybe isolation wasn't a problem to be solved. Maybe it was exactly what he needed. By dawn, Marcus had made his decision. He called the state office listed on the property website and spoke to a bureaucrat named Jennifer Walsh, who seemed surprised that anyone was interested in the lighthouse at all. Mr. Rivera, I have to be very clear about the property's condition, she said. This isn't a fixer-upper project for someone looking for a vacation home. The structure has serious foundation issues. The stairs may not be safe, and there's been no maintenance for decades. We're selling it as is because the state can't afford the liability of continued ownership. I understand, Marcus replied. When can I see it? You want to inspect the property before bidding. I want to inspect it before I decide whether to bid $1 or $2. Jennifer Walsh paused, apparently trying to determine if he was joking. Mr. Rivera, are you familiar with lighthouse restoration? Do you have experience with historic preservation projects? Marcus thought about Afghan villages he'd helped rebuild after Taliban attacks, about improvised repairs made with whatever materials could be scrounged from bomb sites and abandoned buildings. I've worked on challenging renovation projects in difficult environments. 3 days later, Marcus stood on the rocky coast of Maine, watching Jennifer Walsh's sedan navigate the winding dirt road that led to Morrison Point. The October air was crisp and salty, carrying the endless rhythm of waves against stone. Seagulls wheeled overhead, their cries sharp and wild in ways that reminded him of freedom rather than danger. The lighthouse rose before him like a monument to endurance. Its white-painted brick walls were stained with decades of salt, spray, and weather, but the structure itself looked solid. The conical tower stood 7 stories tall, topped by a lantern room where the massive Fresnel lens had once focused beacon light across the dark Atlantic. Jennifer Walsh emerged from her car wearing the expression of someone who'd driven 2 hours to show property to a client who probably couldn't afford to maintain a garden shed, much less a historic lighthouse. She was a pleasant woman in her 50s, gray-haired and practical, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Mr. Rivera? I'm Jennifer Walsh from the State Property Office. I have to say, you're the first person who's actually wanted to visit this place. Most people take one look at the listing and decide they'd rather buy something that comes with electricity and working plumbing. Marcus shook her hand, studying the lighthouse more carefully. The structure showed its age-cracked mortar, loose bricks, sections where the paint had peeled away entirely. But the bones were good. The foundation, massive blocks of granite that had withstood over a century of Atlantic storms. Tell me about the structural issues, he said. Well, there's water damage throughout the lower levels. The spiral staircase has some rotting treads. The lantern room hasn't been maintained since the Coast Guard decommissioned the light. So there could be broken glass or corroded metal up there. Jennifer consulted her clipboard. The keeper's cottage is in even worse shape. Roof partially collapsed, walls compromised by moisture. Probably not salvageable. They walked around the lighthouse's perimeter. Marcus ran his hands along the stone walls, checking for loose mortar and structural cracks. The damage was mostly cosmetic, decades of deferred maintenance rather than fundamental structural failure. The lighthouse had been built to last, constructed with the kind of over-engineering that assumed it would need to survive whatever nature could inflict. What about utilities? None. The power was disconnected when the Coast Guard left. There's an old well, but we can't guarantee the water quality. No sewage system, except an old septic tank that probably needs replacement. Phone lines were removed years ago. Marcus nodded. He'd lived in worse conditions in Afghanistan, in forward operating bases where electricity came from generators and water came from bottles. Isolation didn't scare him. Sometimes it was the only thing that brought peace. Can I see inside? Jennifer produced a heavy ring of keys. The lighthouse door was solid oak, weathered gray but still intact. The lock turned with surprising ease, as if the building had been waiting for someone to return. Inside, the lighthouse was a study in faded grandeur. The circular main room stretched up through the center of the tower, with a spiral staircase winding around the interior walls. Dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight that filtered through salt-stained windows. The air smelled of old stone and sea spray, with undertones of decay that spoke of decades without human habitation. Marcus climbed the spiral stairs carefully, testing each step before putting his full weight on it. Some treads creaked ominously, but the staircase held. Each level of the lighthouse contained a small room that had once served specific functions: storage, equipment rooms, living quarters for the lighthouse keeper. The views from the upper windows were breathtaking. Ocean stretched to the horizon in every direction, broken only by scattered islands and the distant shapes of fishing boats. To the west, the main coastline curved away in a series of rocky headlands and protected coves. This was what the first lighthouse keepers had seen every day. This vast expanse of water and sky that made human problems seem small and temporary. In the lantern room at the top, the original Fresnel lens still sat in its mounting, a marvel of 19th century engineering that had focused oil flame light into beams visible for 20 miles. The lens was cracked in several places, but it remained an impressive sight. Tons of precisely cut glass that had guided countless ships safely home. Marcus stood in the lantern room for a long time, looking out over the Atlantic and imagining the view during storms, when waves would crash against the rocks below, and lighthouse keepers would tend the beacon that meant the difference between life and death, for sailors fighting to reach safe harbor. "Mr. Rivera?" Jennifer's voice echoed from below. "Are you all right up there?" "I'm fine," Marcus called back, just taking it all in. When he descended to the main room, Jennifer was checking her watch and consulting her clipboard again. "Well, you've seen the property. Any questions before you make your decision?" Marcus looked around the circular room one more time. Broken plaster revealed stone walls underneath. Water stains marked places where the roof had leaked during winter storms. The windows needed reglazing. The floors needed refinishing, and every surface required cleaning and maintenance. But there was something about the lighthouse that spoke to him, not its condition, but its purpose. This place had been built to guide lost travelers home, to provide light in darkness, to stand watch over dangerous waters. It was a monument to service, to the idea that some jobs were too important to abandon no matter how difficult or thankless they became. "I'll take it," Marcus said. Jennifer blinked. "Don't you want to think it over? Maybe get a contractor to assess the renovation costs. This isn't the kind of purchase you can easily reverse if you change your mind." "I won't change my mind." Marcus pulled out his wallet and extracted a $1 bill, the same bill he'd been carrying for over a year. A good luck charm given to him by an Afghan boy named Hamid during his final patrol. The boy had smiled and pressed the crumpled dollar into Marcus's hand, saying it was for good fortune. 2 hours later, the convoy had hit the IED that changed everything. Marcus had kept the dollar through his medical evacuation, through months of surgery and rehabilitation, through the long, dark nights when he'd wondered if survival was worth the effort. Now he handed it to Jennifer Walsh, payment in full, for a lighthouse that would either save his life or provide an appropriately dramatic location for its ending. Jennifer stared at the dollar bill for a moment, then carefully folded it into her clipboard. "Mr. Rivera, I hope you know what you're getting into." "I hope so too." The paperwork took 3 hours to complete, most of it warnings and liability waivers that transferred all responsibility for the property's condition to Marcus. He signed each form without reading it carefully, understanding only that he was now the legal owner of Morrison Point Lighthouse and everything that came with it. As Jennifer Walsh drove away, leaving him alone with his new property, Marcus stood in the doorway of the lighthouse and listened to the sound of absolute silence. No traffic, no sirens, no voices from neighboring apartments. Just waves against rocks and wind through empty windows. For the first time in 2 years, the constant buzz of anxiety in his chest quieted to a whisper. Marcus spent his first night in the Lighthouse on an air mattress in the main room, wrapped in a sleeping bag he'd bought at an army surplus store in Portland. He'd driven to Maine in a rental car filled with his few possessions: clothes, tools, canned food, and the .45 pistol he still carried, despite promising himself he'd never need it again. The Lighthouse felt different in darkness. Every sound was amplified: wind whistling through gaps in the stonework, waves crashing against the rocky shore below, the creak and settle of old wood adjusting to temperature changes. But instead of making him nervous, the sounds were oddly comforting. They were natural sounds, predictable, without the underlying menace of human-made noise. Marcus slept better that first night than he had in months. The next morning brought his first real exploration of the property. In daylight, he could see details that had been hidden during his initial inspection. The lighthouse's construction was even more impressive than he'd realized. Walls, 3 feet thick at the base, built from massive granite blocks, fitted together with mathematical precision. This structure had been designed to withstand century-long storms, to stand watch over dangerous waters for generations. The keeper's cottage was indeed beyond salvage. The roof had partially collapsed, and the interior was a maze of rotting beams and water-damaged walls. But the cottage's foundation was solid stone, and Marcus could envision building something new in its place. A simple structure that would provide modern amenities while respecting the lighthouse's historic character. As he explored the property more carefully, Marcus began to notice things that didn't quite fit. Near the lighthouse's foundation, some of the stones were a different color than the rest: darker, older, fitted with a different style of mortar. When he pressed against these stones, they seemed to give slightly, as if there were hollow space behind them. Marcus had developed sharp instincts for things that didn't belong during his military service. Mismatched stones might not be improvised explosive devices, but they deserved investigation. He made a mental note to examine the foundation more carefully once he'd settled into a routine. Over the next week, Marcus established a pattern of life at the lighthouse. He woke before dawn, made coffee on a camp stove, and spent the morning hours exploring different aspects of the property. Afternoons were devoted to basic maintenance: cleaning windows, clearing debris, making lists of supplies he would need for more serious renovation work. The isolation that might have driven another person to distraction felt healing to Marcus. After years of military life surrounded by other soldiers, followed by months of VA programs designed to reintegrate him into society, the simple privacy of lighthouse keeping felt like luxury. He could work at his own pace, think his own thoughts, and deal with his memories without anyone watching for signs of breakdown. The nightmares didn't disappear entirely, but they became less frequent and less intense. Something about sleeping in a structure built for vigilance, built to keep watch over travelers in danger, made the darkness feel safer. He was no longer just a broken veteran trying to survive civilian life. He was a lighthouse keeper, continuing a tradition that stretched back over a century. It was during his second week at Morrison Point that Marcus made the discovery that would change everything. He'd been examining the foundation more systematically, trying to understand the construction techniques used by 19th-century builders. The mismatched stones in the eastern wall continued to puzzle him. They were clearly older than the lighthouse itself, fitted with a style of masonry that suggested earlier construction. Marcus had brought tools from his apartment in Portland, basic hand tools inherited from his father, plus some specialized equipment he'd acquired during his construction work. On impulse, he positioned a pry bar against the mortar joint between two of the darker stones and applied gentle pressure. The mortar crumbled like stale bread. Marcus sat back on his heels, staring at the gap he'd created. The mortar should have been rock-hard after more than a century, but it crumbled as if it had been mixed recently. He worked the pry bar deeper into the joint, and more mortar fell away in chunks. Within an hour, he had loosened 3 large stones, revealing a gap in the wall just large enough for a person to crawl through. Cool air flowed from the opening, carrying scents of salt and earth, and something metallic that he couldn't identify. Marcus shone his flashlight through the gap and saw rough stone walls extending beyond the reach of his beam. Someone had carved a tunnel through the bedrock beneath the lighthouse. Marcus's heart began to pound, not with anxiety but with excitement. This was the first mystery he'd encountered in months that didn't involve reliving traumatic memories or navigating VA bureaucracy. This was exploration, discovery, the kind of purposeful investigation that had kept him sharp during his military service. He gathered proper equipment, flashlight, rope, first aid kit, the service pistol he still carried out of habit, and prepared to investigate the tunnel system beneath his new home. The passage was narrow enough that Marcus had to crawl on hands and knees, his injured leg protesting with each movement. The walls were rough-hewn stone, carved by hand tools rather than modern machinery. Someone had spent considerable time and effort creating this tunnel, shaping it with skill that suggested serious planning rather than casual excavation. 20 feet from the entrance, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. Marcus emerged into a circular room carved from living bedrock. His flashlight revealed stone walls covered with symbols, not random scratches, but deliberate markings that formed patterns and sequences. Stars, anchors, ships, and designs he couldn't immediately identify. At the center of the room sat a wooden chest. Marcus approached the chest slowly, flashlight beams sweeping across iron fittings that were green with age but still intact. The chest wasn't locked. Whoever had placed it here hadn't expected anyone else to find it. The lid opened with a groan that seemed to echo forever in the stone chamber. Inside, nestled in what had once been silk but was now rotted fabric, lay gold bars. Each bar was roughly the size of a brick, stamped with symbols Marcus didn't recognize. The chest contained at least 20 of them, more wealth than Marcus had ever seen in one place. He lifted one bar with trembling hands. It was heavier than he'd expected, cold and smooth, unmistakably genuine. This wasn't fool's gold or a clever fake. This was real treasure, hidden beneath the lighthouse for reasons he could only guess at. Marcus sat back against the chamber wall, gold bar still clutched in his hands, and tried to process what he'd discovered. The lighthouse purchase that had seemed like desperate escapism suddenly felt like destiny. He'd paid $1 for property that contained what might be millions of dollars in hidden treasure. But more than the monetary value, the discovery represented something else. Proof that broken places could hold unexpected gifts, that careful investigation could reveal secrets worth protecting. For the first time since his medical discharge, Marcus felt truly alive, energized by mystery rather than haunted by memories. His flashlight revealed additional passages leading from the main chamber, promising more discoveries, more secrets hidden in the darkness. Beneath Morrison Point, tomorrow he would explore further, would begin to understand what he'd found and why someone had hidden it here. Tonight, he would return to the lighthouse proper, seal the entrance to protect his discovery, and plan his next steps carefully. Whatever lay hidden beneath his lighthouse, whatever story these tunnels and treasures told, Marcus Rivera would uncover it methodically and completely. He'd bought the lighthouse hoping to find peace. Instead, he'd found purpose. Marcus spent the entire night awake. Not from nightmares for once, but from the electric anticipation of discovery coursing through his veins. The gold bar sat on his makeshift table, catching moonlight that streamed through the lighthouse windows like a promise made manifest. Every time he looked at it, his pulse quickened. This wasn't just random treasure, the craftsmanship of the bar, the careful stamping, the precision of its construction, suggested something far more organized than simple piracy. As dawn broke over the Atlantic, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Marcus prepared for a more thorough exploration of the underground chambers. He'd been a demolition specialist in Afghanistan, trained to think systematically about hidden spaces and concealed threats. The single chamber he'd discovered was unlikely to be the extent of whatever lay beneath the lighthouse. He gathered proper equipment this time: multiple flashlights, extra batteries, measuring tape, a digital camera, rope, basic tools, and enough water and energy bars to sustain him for hours underground. Most importantly, he brought the notebook he'd used for tactical observations in Afghanistan. If he was going to uncover secrets that had been hidden for centuries, he would document everything methodically. The return journey through the narrow tunnel felt easier now that he knew what to expect. Marcus emerged into the circular chamber and immediately began a more systematic examination of what he'd found the previous night. In his initial excitement, he'd focused entirely on the chest of gold bars. Now he could see details that darkness and adrenaline had obscured. The symbols carved into the chamber walls weren't random decorations, they told a story. Near the tunnel entrance, rough ships flew flags Marcus didn't recognize. As the narrative progressed around the chamber, the ships grew larger and more detailed. Battle scenes were depicted with crude but effective artistry. Cannon fire, sinking vessels, men with cutlasses boarding merchant ships, pirates. This had been a pirate's hiding place. But that realization raised more questions than it answered. The chamber showed signs of long-term use, not hasty concealment. Someone had spent considerable time down here, carving walls, creating storage, building something permanent. The gold bars weren't just hastily buried loot. They were part of an organized system. Marcus photographed every wall carving, every symbol, every detail that might provide clues about who had built this place and why. Then he turned his attention to the passages leading from the main chamber. The first tunnel sloped sharply downward, requiring Marcus to use rope as a safety line. It ended in a smaller chamber that had clearly served as some kind of workshop. Stone shelves held the remnants of tools, hammers, chisels, metal implements so old their original purpose could only be guessed. Someone had been working down here, not just hiding things, but actively using this space for extended periods. The workshop contained something else that made Marcus's breath catch: scales, precision balances for weighing precious metals, still sitting on stone tables as if their operators had just stepped away. Beside them lay metal molds, crucibles, and other equipment for melting and reshaping gold and silver. This wasn't just a hiding place. It was a mint, a place where stolen goods had been converted into more portable and less identifiable forms. The second passage from the main chamber was partially collapsed, but Marcus managed to squeeze through fallen stones. Beyond the obstruction lay the discovery that would change his understanding of everything. The chamber was vast, larger than the lighthouse's foundation, carved from solid bedrock with architectural sophistication that spoke of serious planning and unlimited time. Stone pillars supported a vaulted ceiling that disappeared beyond his flashlight's reach. Carved niches lined the walls like some ancient mausoleum, and in each niche sat containers, wooden chests, iron strongboxes, ceramic urns sealed with wax. Marcus stood in the center of the chamber, his headlamp beam sweeping across what could only be described as a treasury. This wasn't a simple pirate's cave, this was a vault, a repository built by someone who intended to return again and again, someone who needed secure, long-term storage for the profits of a very successful criminal enterprise. He approached the nearest chest with hands that trembled despite his efforts to stay calm. Like the first chest, it wasn't locked. Inside lay Spanish coins, hundreds of them, silver reals, bearing the faces of long-dead kings. The coins alone represented a fortune. But below them, wrapped in oiled cloth that had somehow survived centuries underground, were documents. Marcus carefully unfolded one of the papers. The ink had faded but was still legible. Written in flowing script, inventory of goods taken from the merchant vessel, Santa Isabella, October 17, 1741. 37 bars of silver, 86 pieces of 8. Religious artifacts of considerable value, personal jewelry estimated at £400 sterling, a manifest. These weren't random pirates hiding stolen loot in whatever cave they could find. This was an organized operation, meticulous enough to keep detailed records of every robbery, every captured ship, every ounce of precious metal acquired. Marcus moved to another chest, then another, finding similar inventories in each container. The manifestos painted a picture of systematic piracy that had operated for years, attacking ships from multiple nations, stealing everything from church gold to royal treasures to simple merchant cargo. But it was the fourth chest that made Marcus sink to his knees in amazement. Emeralds. The largest emeralds he'd ever seen, each one the size of a child's fist, sitting nestled in individual silk pouches like sleeping dragons. Marcus held one up to his headlamp, watching green fire dance in depths that seemed to contain entire worlds. He'd seen similar stones in museums, displayed behind bulletproof glass, with armed guards stationed nearby. And there were dozens of them. Marcus sat back against the chamber wall, trying to process the magnitude of what he'd discovered. This wasn't a single chest of pirate gold. This was the accumulated wealth of an entire criminal empire, methodically catalogued and stored over what appeared to be years of successful operation. He spent the next 4 hours documenting everything he could find. His camera's memory card filled up before he was halfway through the first row of containers. Some chests contained items he couldn't immediately identify. Strange sculptures, carved masks, artifacts that appeared to be from cultures he didn't recognize. These pirates hadn't limited themselves to local waters, they'd been international criminals, sailing the world's oceans and taking treasure wherever they could find it. As Marcus worked, he began to notice patterns in the dates on various manifests. The earliest document he found was from 1738, the latest from 1744. 6 years of systematic piracy, all ending abruptly in the middle of 1744. What had happened? Why had the pirates stopped coming to their carefully constructed treasury? Why had this immense wealth been left to gather dust for nearly 3 centuries? In the largest chest, positioned at the center of the chamber like some kind of altar, Marcus found what might have been the answer. At the bottom, beneath layers of gold coins and silver bars, lay a leather journal bound with brass fittings that had turned green with age. The pages were yellowed and brittle, but the writing was still legible. The 13th day of August, 1744. The first entry read, "We are discovered at last." The British Navy hunts us with 3 ships of the line, and there is nowhere left to run. Captain Blackheart has decided we must scatter, each man to his own survival. The treasure stays hidden until we can return safely. God willing, we shall see it again when the Crown's attention turns elsewhere. The entry was signed T. Morrison, Navigator Morrison, the same name as the lighthouse keeper who had vanished in 1898. Could Samuel Morrison have been descended from these pirates? Had family stories led him to search for ancestral treasure hidden beneath the very lighthouse he tended? Marcus flipped through more pages of the journal, his excitement growing with each entry. The book detailed years of successful piracy raids on Spanish treasure fleets, attacks on merchant vessels carrying everything from church gold to royal payrolls, and always the careful return to this hidden base to store their profits. Our fortress beneath the light, one entry called their treasury, where the beacon warns ships away from dangerous rocks while our real treasures lie safe below, waiting for the day we can retire from this dangerous trade and live as gentlemen should. The pirates had built their vault first, then arranged for the lighthouse to be constructed above it. They'd hidden their criminal enterprise beneath the very structure meant to protect innocent shipping from the treacherous rocks of Morrison Point. Marcus found more journals in other chests, written by different hands, but telling the same story. Someone called Captain Blackheart had commanded a fleet of ships that terrorized shipping lanes throughout the North Atlantic for over a decade. They'd been successful enough to accumulate wealth that would challenge modern billionaires, but success had brought unwanted attention. By 1744, the British Navy had made their capture a top priority. The final journal entry, written in a shaking hand by someone who signed himself only as the last keeper of the flame, told of the fleet's destruction. Blackheart is dead, killed in the attack on HMS Sovereign's Pride. The Raven's Nest burns in the harbor at Port Royal. Of our 30 proud ships, only 3 remain, and those scattered to whatever safe harbors we can find. We scatter to the winds like leaves before a storm, and pray that our secret dies with us rather than fall into the hands of those who would use it only for personal gain. The secret had died with them, buried beneath the lighthouse for 2.5 centuries. But it hadn't stayed buried forever. Marcus thought about Samuel Morrison, the lighthouse keeper who'd vanished without explanation. Had Morrison family stories preserved some memory of the treasure? Had Samuel spent his life searching for wealth hidden by his own ancestors? Marcus spent another hour calculating rough values based on the manifests and his own estimates of precious metal weights. Spanish gold, Chinese jade, African diamonds, European church treasures, royal artifacts. From 6 nations, the conservative estimate came to over $200 million in current values, and that was assuming the historical artifacts had no premium beyond their material worth. $220 million. The number seemed impossible, abstract, like something from a movie rather than reality. Yesterday, Marcus had been a disabled veteran living on government checks, wondering if his life had any purpose left. Today he was potentially one of the richest men in America, owner of a treasure that pirates had accumulated through years of successful crime. But wealth of this magnitude came with complications that simple money couldn't solve. As Marcus made his way back to the lighthouse's main level, sealing the entrance carefully behind him, he began to consider the legal and practical implications of his discovery. Did the treasure belong to him by right of property ownership? Or did it legally belong to the descendants of the people from whom it had been stolen? What about the federal government's claims on historical artifacts? What about the international implications of artifacts that had been stolen from multiple nations? And perhaps most importantly, what about the people who might still be searching for this treasure? Marcus made dinner canned chili heated on his camp stove while researching treasure lore on his laptop. The legal situation was murky at best. Some precedents favored the finder of abandoned property. Others established government claims on historical artifacts discovered on private land. International maritime law added another layer of complexity, especially given that some of the treasure had clearly been stolen from ships of nations that still existed. One thing was clear from his research. If Marcus wanted to keep any portion of this discovery, he needed to be very careful about how he proceeded. The wrong move could result in everything being confiscated while lawyers argued for years about proper ownership. As night fell over Morrison Point, Marcus stood in the lighthouse's lantern room, looking out over the same waters that had once been terrorized by Captain Blackheart's fleet. Ships' lights moved slowly across the horizon, modern vessels with GPS and satellite communication, electronic navigation that made lighthouses obsolete. But underneath his feet lay treasure from an age when navigation meant reading stars and weather patterns, when pirates could disappear into fog banks and hidden coves, when the difference between wealth and poverty, between freedom and the hangman's noose, often came down to pure luck and careful planning. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The number on the display was from the VA clinic in Portland. "Mr. Rivera, this is Dr. Sarah Chen. I wanted to follow up on your missed appointment last week." Marcus's blood went cold. In his excitement over the treasure discovery, he'd completely forgotten about his scheduled evaluation, the one that would determine whether the VA considered him mentally stable enough to live independently. "I apologize, doctor. I've been dealing with some personal matters. I recently moved to a new property in Maine, and the transition has been more involved than I expected." "I see. Well, that might actually be positive. A change of environment can be therapeutic for veterans dealing with isolation and depression. How are you feeling about the move?" Marcus looked around the lighthouse, thinking about the vast treasure hidden below, about the legal research he needed to conduct, about the careful planning required to protect and preserve his discovery. "I feel like I've found my purpose," he said. And for the first time in months, he meant it completely. "That's wonderful to hear. But we do need to complete your evaluation. The review board has some concerns about your previous psychological assessments. Can you come in next week?" Marcus thought about federal bureaucrats and government psychiatrists learning about his treasure discovery, about the potential for his claim to be dismissed as the delusional fantasy of a mentally unstable veteran. "Of course," he lied smoothly. "I'll call tomorrow to schedule something." After hanging up, Marcus sat in the darkness of the lighthouse, weighing his options. The smart thing might be to report his discovery immediately to proper authorities, archaeologists, historians, legal experts, who could help navigate the complex process of establishing ownership. But he'd learned not to trust government bureaucrats with his welfare, and $220 million would certainly attract attention from people who might not have his best interests in mind. On the other hand, attempting to hide or sell the treasure privately would be illegal and dangerous. The kind of wealth he'd discovered attracted the kind of people who solved problems with violence rather than lawsuits. Marcus descended into the treasury one more time before sleep, not to catalog more treasure, but simply to convince himself it was real. In the vast chamber, surrounded by centuries of accumulated pirate wealth, he felt connected to something larger than his own struggles with trauma and purposelessness. Those pirates had been soldiers of a sort, fighting their own wars against a world that offered limited opportunities for men skilled primarily in violence. They'd built something permanent here, something that had outlasted their ships and their lives, something that connected past and future in ways they probably never imagined. Whatever legal complications lay ahead, whatever bureaucratic battles awaited him, Marcus knew he wouldn't simply hand over his discovery to government officials who would lock it away in some warehouse or museum basement. This treasure had been hidden for a purpose, preserved by men who'd understood that sometimes the most valuable things were worth protecting at any cost. Tomorrow he would begin the careful process of documenting everything more thoroughly, researching the legal requirements for his situation, and planning how to preserve this piece of history while securing his own future. He would need lawyers, archaeologists, historians, security experts, an entire team of professionals who could help him navigate challenges he'd never imagined facing. Tonight, he would sleep peacefully, for the first time since his medical discharge, dreaming not of explosions and casualties but of ships with black flags and men brave enough to hide their treasure where only the most determined searcher would think to look. The lighthouse beam no longer guided ships through dangerous waters, but beneath it, something far more valuable waited in patient darkness. Marcus Rivera, wounded warrior turned accidental treasure guardian, would make sure it saw light again, but only when he was ready, only when he could protect it properly, and only on his own terms. The pirates had waited almost 3 centuries for someone worthy to find their legacy. Marcus intended to prove himself worthy of their trust. The first sign of trouble came exactly 1 week after Marcus had documented the full scope of his discovery. He was sitting at his laptop, researching maritime salvage law, and trying to understand the bewildering maze of federal regulations that might apply to his treasure, when he heard vehicles approaching on the access road. Through the lighthouse windows, Marcus could see 2 black SUVs navigating the rocky path with the careful precision of drivers who weren't local. These weren't tourists or curious neighbors. The vehicles had the unmistakable look of official business, the kind that rarely brought good news to people like him. Marcus quickly closed his laptop and scattered some renovation tools around the main room, trying to look like a man who'd been doing ordinary repair work rather than researching how to legally claim a $200 million pirate treasure. He'd been dreading this moment, knowing that his discovery was too significant to remain secret forever. Heavy knocks echoed through the lighthouse before he'd finished his hasty preparations. "Mr. Rivera, Federal Bureau of Investigation. We'd like to speak with you." Marcus opened the door to find 2 agents in dark suits, both wearing the kind of neutral expressions that suggested this wasn't a social visit. The woman was tall, blonde, probably in her 40s, with sharp eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of his appearance. The man was younger, Hispanic, with the sort of build that suggested military background. "I'm Special Agent Sarah Martinez," the woman said, displaying her credentials. "This is Special Agent Daniel Rodriguez. May we come in?" "Of course." Marcus stepped aside, mind racing through possible explanations for their visit. Had someone reported his discovery? Had his internet research triggered some kind of federal monitoring system? Or was this about something else entirely? The agents looked around the lighthouse's main room, taking in the sparse furnishings, the obvious renovation work, the general atmosphere of a man trying to build a new life in isolation. "Mr. Rivera," Agent Martinez began, "we understand you recently purchased this property from the state of Maine." "That's right. $1 at auction. I have the paperwork, if you want to see it." "That won't be necessary. We're here about something else entirely." Agent Rodriguez stepped forward. "Are you familiar with the name Thomas Morrison?" Marcus's heart skipped, but he kept his expression neutral. "Should I be?" Thomas Morrison was a historian and genealogist who'd been researching this area for over 20 years. Specifically, he'd been investigating claims that this lighthouse sits above a cache of stolen treasure hidden by 18th-century pirates. Marcus felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool ocean air. That sounds like the kind of local folklore you hear about a lot of old buildings. Buried treasure, ghost stories, that sort of thing. Uncrisis prize, uncrisis from contents, uncrisis from contents from self. Agent Martinez pulled out a photograph. Thomas Morrison was found dead in his hotel room in Portland 3 days ago. Apparent heart attack, but he'd been asking very specific questions about recent property sales in this area. Your purchase was one of the transactions he'd inquired about most persistently. The photograph showed an elderly man with white hair and kind eyes, someone who looked like he might have been a retired professor. Marcus studied the image, trying to appear curious rather than alarmed. "I'm sorry to hear about his death, but I still don't understand what this has to do with me. Mr. Rivera." Agent Martinez leaned forward slightly. Thomas Morrison didn't just believe in local folklore. He had documentation, family papers, historical records, ship manifests that he claimed proved a pirate fleet had used this location as their primary base of operations between 1738 and 1744. Agent Rodriguez opened a briefcase and pulled out photocopied documents. Morrison had been in contact with our office because some of the treasure he was seeking included federal property, payroll shipments that were stolen from colonial military units, tax revenues that were being transported to federal repositories. Marcus glanced at the documents, recognizing some of them as similar to the manifests he'd found in the underground chamber. His mouth went dry, but he forced himself to respond calmly. "Even if this Thomas Morrison was right about historical piracy in the area, I don't see how that concerns me. I bought a lighthouse, not a treasure map. The concern," Agent Martinez said, "is that Thomas Morrison believed he was close to making a breakthrough in his research. According to his notes, he'd identified this property as the most likely location for what he called the Vault of Stars, the pirates' primary treasure repository. And you think I might have found something?" "We think someone might have found something," Agent Rodriguez replied. Thomas Morrison was in contact with several private collectors, antiquities dealers, and what we might charitably call treasure recovery specialists in the weeks before his death. There's been increased chatter in those circles about significant discoveries in coastal Maine. Agent Martinez stood and walked to the window, looking out over the Atlantic. "Mr. Rivera, I want to be very clear about something. If historical artifacts or treasures are discovered on private property in Maine, there are specific legal requirements for reporting those discoveries. Failure to comply with those requirements can result in federal charges for theft of cultural property." "I understand." "Good. Because if you were to discover anything historically significant on this property, you'd want to contact the appropriate authorities immediately, not just for legal compliance, but for your own protection." "Protection from what?" Agent Rodriguez closed his briefcase. "From people who might be interested in acquiring historical treasures through methods that don't involve lawyers and courtrooms." After the agents left, Marcus sat in the lighthouse for a long time, thinking. The walls were closing in faster than he'd anticipated. Government agents, mysterious deaths, private collectors with questionable ethics. His simple renovation project was rapidly becoming something much more dangerous. But he wasn't ready to surrender his discovery. Not yet. That evening, Marcus drove into Prospect Harbor for supplies and to get a better sense of local sentiment. The town was small enough that strangers were noticed, and FBI agents asking questions would certainly have attracted attention. At Bradshaw's hardware store, the owner confirmed Marcus's suspicions. We had some government folks through here yesterday, Tom Bradshaw said, while ringing up Marcus's purchase of additional security equipment. Asking about you. About the lighthouse. About whether anyone's been poking around historical sites lately. What did you tell them? Told them the truth, that you seem like a decent fellow trying to fix up that old wreck, and that most folks around here mind their own business. Tom leaned across the counter conspiratorially. But I also told them about the Morrison family. Marcus's pulse quickened. What about them? Well, that Thomas Morrison fellow they were asking about, he wasn't the first Morrison to come sniffing around here looking for treasure. His family's been at it for generations, going back to old Samuel Morrison, who kept the light. Tom pulled out a yellowed newspaper clipping from beneath the counter. This here's from 1947. Shows another Morrison, Thomas's father. I think with a team of men who came up here with metal detectors and digging equipment. They spent 2 weeks combing every inch of the point before giving up. The photograph showed a group of men standing beside the lighthouse, holding various pieces of equipment. The resemblance between the older Morrison and the man in Agent Martinez's photograph was unmistakable. They never found anything. Nothing they admitted to finding, Tom said. But old-timers around here remember that Morrison fellow left in an awful hurry, packed up his equipment in the middle of the night, and drove south without saying goodbye to anyone. Marcus studied the photograph more carefully. Any idea why he left so suddenly? Rumors were that he'd been getting threatening phone calls, someone who didn't want him digging around the lighthouse. Someone with enough influence to make a man abandon a search he'd been planning for years. That night, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He'd learned to trust his instincts in Afghanistan, and those instincts were screaming warnings now. He installed motion sensors around the lighthouse perimeter and set up a simple alarm system that would alert him to anyone approaching the property after dark. His precautions proved justified when the sensors triggered at 2:37 a.m. Marcus grabbed his service pistol and night vision scope, moving carefully to a second-floor window that offered a view of the access road. 2 figures in dark clothing were examining the ground around his truck, using small flashlights that they clearly thought couldn't be seen from the lighthouse. The men weren't FBI agents, their movements were too furtive, too practiced. These were professionals of a different sort, people who solved problems quietly and didn't leave paperwork trails. Marcus watched them work for 20 minutes, photographing tire tracks, checking for signs of recent excavation, systematically searching the area around the lighthouse for evidence of his activities. One of them placed a small device under his truck's rear bumper, a GPS tracker. After the men left, Marcus waited another hour before venturing outside to remove the tracking device. As he examined the small electronic unit, he realized that his situation had moved beyond legal complications into something much more dangerous. Someone was willing to conduct illegal surveillance to monitor his activities, which meant someone suspected he'd found the treasure. The next morning brought a phone call that confirmed his fears. Mr. Rivera. My name is Jonathan Blackwood. I represent certain interests that may have a claim on property you've recently acquired. The voice carried an accent Marcus couldn't place, cultured, old money, with undertones of barely controlled threat. What kind of property? Items that may have been stored on your land by my ancestors. I have documentation proving family ownership dating back 9 generations. I'm prepared to offer you generous compensation for their return, or we can resolve this through legal channels that you might find less pleasant." Marcus thought about the pirate journals he'd found, about Captain Blackheart, and the manifests detailing years of systematic theft. "Your ancestors were pirates who stole everything they hid. I don't think family ownership applies to stolen property." The silence stretched long enough to become menacing. "History is written by the victors, Mr. Rivera. My ancestor was a privateer who served Crown interests during a complex period of international relations. The legal distinction matters considerably. And if I don't agree to your generous compensation, then we'll see how well a disabled veteran with documented PTSD fares against lawyers who've been protecting family interests for 3 centuries. I trust you'll consider our offer carefully." The line went dead, leaving Marcus staring at his phone with growing anger. He'd survived 3 combat deployments and improvised explosive devices, only to come home and face threats from aristocratic descendants of criminals who thought their family name gave them rights to stolen treasure. That afternoon, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. Instead of trying to handle the situation alone, he would build allies in the local community. People who understood what it meant to fight for something worth protecting. People who didn't appreciate outsiders threatening their neighbors. He started at the Prospect Harbor Historical Society, housed in a converted church on the town's main street. The volunteer coordinator, Grace Turner, was eager to discuss local history with someone who showed genuine interest. "Oh my, yes," she said, when Marcus explained his research into the Lighthouse's background. "The Morrison family story is one of our most fascinating unsolved mysteries. That poor Samuel Morrison, vanishing without a trace after spending years searching for something he claimed was hidden in the lighthouse." Grace pulled out a thick folder filled with newspaper clippings, historical documents, and handwritten notes. "We've had researchers come through here for decades, all trying to piece together what Samuel Morrison was looking for. Most recently, that lovely Thomas Morrison from Boston. Such a shame about his passing. Did Thomas Morrison share his research with you?" "Oh yes. He was very generous with his findings. Made copies of everything for our archives." Grace opened the folder and began laying out documents. Fascinating material, really. Ship manifests, customs records, letters from British naval officers describing pirate activity in these waters during the 1740s. Marcus studied the documents, many of which confirmed details he'd found in the underground chamber. Thomas Morrison had been thorough, tracking down evidence from archives across New England, and even some European sources. Did Thomas seem worried about anything during his last visit? Grace's expression grew troubled. "Now that you mention it, he did seem anxious. Said he'd been getting phone calls from people claiming to represent interested parties. People who wanted to buy his research, or who offered to fund his search in exchange for a share of whatever he found." "Did he say who these people were?" "No. But he was frightened enough that he made multiple copies of all his documents. Said if anything happened to him, he wanted to be sure his life's work wasn't lost." Grace gestured to the folder. "Everything's here if you'd like to examine it more carefully." Marcus spent the rest of the afternoon reading through Thomas Morrison's research. The man had been meticulous to the point of obsession, following paper trails across 3 centuries, correlating weather records with ship movements, analyzing tidal patterns that might have affected pirate operations. Most importantly, Morrison had documented the Blackwood family's attempts to claim the treasure over multiple generations. Jonathan Blackwood wasn't the first descendant to assert ownership. His family had been pressuring researchers and intimidating potential searchers for decades. But Morrison had found something that undermined the Blackwood family's claims entirely. In 1843, Captain Edward Blackwood had been court-martialed by the British Navy for conduct unbecoming an officer and piracy upon the high seas. The official records showed that Blackwood had been stripped of his commission and sentenced to hang, though he'd escaped custody before the sentence could be carried out. There had been no privateer commission, no legal authority for Blackwood's activities. He'd been a common pirate, and his family's claims of legitimate salvage rights were based on fabricated documents they'd been using to intimidate researchers for over a century. Armed with this information, Marcus felt confident enough to take the next step in protecting his discovery. He called a meeting at the Prospect Harbor Community Center, inviting anyone interested in local history and historic preservation. Word spread quickly through the small town. By the appointed evening, nearly 50 people had gathered in the community center's main room. Fishermen, retirees, shop owners, teachers, and long-time residents who'd grown up hearing stories about the lighthouse's mysterious past. Marcus stood before the group, nervous but determined to handle this situation openly rather than allowing outside interests to control the narrative. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "Most of you probably know me as the guy who bought the old lighthouse for $1. What you might not know is that I recently made a discovery that could be very significant for our community." The room quieted, everyone leaning forward with interest. "During renovation work, I found evidence that the lighthouse was built over a site that pirates used as a base of operations during the 1740s. I've discovered artifacts, documents, and other items that represent an important piece of maritime history." Murmurs filled the room. Several people nodded knowingly. The pirate stories had been part of local folklore for generations. The problem is that certain outside interests want to claim this discovery for themselves. Government agencies, private collectors, and people claiming to represent descendant families. They're using legal pressure, intimidation, and worse, to try to take control of something that rightfully belongs here, in this community where it's been hidden for almost 3 centuries. Tom Bradshaw stood up from the back of the room. "What kind of intimidation are we talking about? Surveillance, threats, mysterious deaths of researchers who got too close to the truth. The historian Thomas Morrison didn't die of natural causes. He was killed because he was about to expose the truth about this treasure." The room erupted in angry conversation. These were people who'd lived through economic hardship, who'd watched their fishing industry decline, who'd seen outsiders come in and buy up waterfront property for summer homes while local families struggled to stay afloat. "What do you need from us?" asked Father Miguel Santos, the priest from St. Catherine's Catholic Church. "I need witnesses," Marcus said. "I need people who can document what I've found, who can serve as guardians for this piece of history, who can make sure it benefits this community, instead of disappearing into some private collection or government warehouse." Grace Turner raised her hand. "The Historical Society would be honored to help preserve and document anything you've discovered. We have experience with artifact preservation, and we understand the legal requirements for handling historical discoveries. And we've got security covered," added Sheriff Dave Mullins, a grizzled man in his 60s who'd been keeping peace in Prospect Harbor for over 20 years. "Anyone comes around here making threats, they'll deal with local law enforcement, not just federal agents who might have their own agendas." Over the next week, Marcus's simple lighthouse renovation became a community project unlike anything Prospect Harbor had ever seen. Volunteers arrived daily, retired teachers who helped research historical documentation, local contractors who assisted with proper excavation techniques, even high school students who were eager to participate in what their history teacher called living archaeology. Dr. Amanda Foster arrived from the University of Maine with a team of graduate students and professional-grade documentation equipment. Unlike the government agents or private collectors who'd been circling the discovery, Dr. Foster understood that historical preservation required community support and local expertise. "Mr. Rivera," she said, after spending an entire day examining the underground chambers, "what you've found here is extraordinary. Not just the monetary value, but the historical significance. This is one of the most complete pirate archives ever discovered in North America. Can you help me protect it? We can help you preserve it properly while building a legal case for local ownership. Under Maine law, you have strong rights as the finder, especially since the property was legally abandoned and you followed proper procedures for reporting the discovery." The community support proved crucial when Jonathan Blackwood arrived in person, accompanied by a team of lawyers and what appeared to be private security contractors. Blackwood was exactly what Marcus had expected. A man in his 50s, wearing an expensive suit, and the kind of arrogant expression that came from generations of inherited wealth. He arrived at the lighthouse in a convoy of black vehicles, clearly expecting to intimidate an isolated veteran into surrendering valuable property. Instead, he found a parking lot full of local vehicles, a sheriff's deputy stationed at the access road, and a crowd of Prospect Harbor residents who'd come to support their newest neighbor. "Mr. Rivera," Blackwood said, approaching with his lawyers in tow, "I trust you've considered our offer carefully." "I have," Marcus replied, standing with Tom Bradshaw, Sheriff Mullins, Dr. Foster, and a dozen other community members. "And I've decided to decline." Blackwood's expression darkened. "I don't think you understand the legal complexities involved here. My family has legitimate claims that predate your property ownership by centuries." "Your family," Sheriff Mullins interjected, "doesn't have any legal standing in Maine. This is Mr. Rivera's property, legally purchased, and any artifacts found here are his to dispose of as he sees fit under state law. Furthermore, Dr. Foster added, our research has confirmed that your ancestor was a common pirate with no legal authority for his activities. Any claims based on privateer commissions are fraudulent." Blackwood looked around at the assembled crowd, clearly not having expected organized resistance. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "There are federal considerations, international law, claims from multiple governments. You people have no idea what you're interfering with." "We know exactly what we're dealing with," Grace Turner said firmly. "We're dealing with outsiders who want to steal our history and profit from our community's heritage. That's not happening on our watch." After Blackwood and his entourage left, the community celebration was immediate and heartfelt. Someone brought beer, someone else contributed lobster rolls, and the lighthouse grounds filled with the kind of neighborhood gathering that Prospect Harbor hadn't seen in years. "You know," Tom Bradshaw said to Marcus as they watched the sun set over the Atlantic, "this town's been struggling for a long time. Fishing industry's not what it used to be. Young people leave for opportunities in bigger cities. But this discovery of yours, if we handle it right, it could bring new life to this place." Marcus nodded, understanding that his treasure discovery was about more than personal wealth. It was about proving that small communities could fight for their own interests, that ordinary people could stand up to government pressure and private intimidation when they worked together. The pirates who'd hidden their treasure beneath Morrison Point had been outlaws fighting against established authority. In a way, Marcus and his neighbors were doing the same thing, protecting something valuable from people who thought power and money gave them the right to take whatever they wanted. As the evening wound down and the last neighbors headed home, Marcus stood in the lighthouse's lantern room, looking out over waters that had once been terrorized by pirate ships. Below him, hidden in chambers carved from solid rock, lay wealth beyond imagination. But the real treasure wasn't gold or emeralds, it was the discovery that he wasn't alone, that his community would stand with him when powerful interests tried to take what was rightfully his. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Federal bureaucrats, international claims, legal complexities that would take months or years to resolve. But tonight, Marcus Rivera felt something he hadn't experienced since his medical discharge. The strength that comes from belonging somewhere, from fighting alongside people who understood what was worth protecting. The lighthouse beam no longer guided ships through dangerous waters, but it had found a new purpose, serving as a beacon for a community that refused to let outsiders steal their heritage. Whatever battles lay ahead, Marcus knew he wouldn't face them alone. 6 months after the confrontation with Jonathan Blackwood, Marcus Rivera stood in the same underground chamber where he'd first discovered pirate gold. But everything had changed. The rough stone walls now held professional lighting systems. The dirt floor had been replaced with climate-controlled platforms that protected the artifacts while allowing access for research and documentation. Glass display cases housed the most valuable pieces, each one accompanied by detailed historical information that Dr. Foster's team had painstakingly researched. But the transformation went far beyond simple preservation. The Keeper's Light Maritime Museum and Veterans Recovery Center had officially opened to the public 3 weeks ago, and reservations were already booked solid through the following year. Tour buses navigated the winding coastal road daily, bringing visitors who came to see one of the most significant pirate treasure discoveries in North American history. More important to Marcus than the crowds of tourists were the other visitors, the ones who came not for treasure but for healing. Marcus, Dr. Amanda Foster approached carrying a clipboard and wearing the satisfied expression of someone whose ambitious project had exceeded all expectations. The final insurance appraisal came through this morning. Marcus looked up from the display case he'd been adjusting, one that held the leather journal of T. Morrison, the pirate navigator who documented the fleet's final days. What's the total? $237 million. Not counting the historical artifacts that the assessors said couldn't be properly valued in monetary terms. Dr. Foster smiled. You were actually conservative in your original estimates. Marcus nodded. But the astronomical figure didn't carry the same weight it once had. Money had become a tool rather than a goal, a means to accomplish something far more important than personal wealth. How many applications have we received for the residential program? 68 so far, with more inquiries coming in every day. The first group of 12 veterans will arrive next Monday, and the waiting list extends into next year. Dr. Foster consulted her notes. The job training workshops are at capacity, and we've had requests from 3 other states asking for help setting up similar programs. The Keeper's Light Veterans Recovery Center had been Marcus's idea, but it had taken a team of specialists to make it reality. Veterans struggling with PTSD, traumatic brain injury, addiction, or simply the difficult transition to civilian life could come to the Lighthouse for residential treatment that combined traditional therapy with hands-on work that gave them purpose and pride. The program's cornerstone was what they called restoration therapy. Veterans worked alongside master craftsmen to restore classic cars, rebuild engines, renovate historic buildings, and learn trades that would support them long after they left the program. Something about working with their hands, about taking broken things and making them functional and beautiful again, seemed to help heal wounds that traditional therapy couldn't reach. The boat restoration workshop is particularly popular, Dr. Foster continued. Captain Murphy says his participants are learning skills they can use in the maritime industry. But more importantly, they're learning to trust themselves with complex tasks again. Captain Murphy was a retired Navy Master Chief who'd volunteered to run the Marine Trades program. Like many of the staff members at Keepers Light, he was a veteran himself, someone who understood the specific challenges of transitioning from military to civilian life. Marcus walked through the renovated lighthouse, checking on the various programs that had transformed the isolated structure into a bustling center of activity. The main floor housed the museum and visitor center. The second and third floors had been converted into comfortable dormitory-style housing for the residential program participants. The fourth floor contained classrooms and therapy spaces. The fifth floor held Marcus's private apartment, modest quarters that overlooked the ocean and reminded him daily of how far he'd traveled from that first desperate night when he'd bought the lighthouse for $1. In the renovated keeper's cottage, machine shops hummed with activity as veterans learned to rebuild motorcycle engines, restore antique firearms, and craft custom metalwork. The sounds of productive work had replaced the lonely whistle of wind through empty buildings. Outside, in workshops built specifically for the program, other veterans practiced carpentry, boat building, and stone masonry, the same skills that had built the lighthouse itself over a century ago. Every skill taught at Keepers Light was marketable, something participants could use to build careers and support families. But the technical training was only part of the program's success. Mr. Rivera, a young woman, approached wearing the burgundy polo shirt that identified staff members. "There's someone here to see you. Says it's important." Marcus followed her to the visitor reception area, where a man in his early 30s sat stiffly in one of the comfortable chairs they'd positioned near the large windows overlooking the Atlantic. The man had the unmistakable bearing of military service, straight posture, alert eyes that constantly scanned his surroundings, hands that rested but never quite relaxed. "You wanted to see me." The man stood quickly, extending his hand. "Sir, I'm Staff Sergeant David Chen, Army Rangers. I heard about your program through the VA network. I was wondering. I'd like to apply for the residential program." Marcus shook the offered hand. Noting the slight tremor that spoke of struggles he recognized all too well. "Have you filled out an application?" "Yes, sir, but I wanted to speak with you personally. I read about what happened to you, about how you found this place and what you've built here." Chen's voice was carefully controlled, but Marcus could hear the desperation underneath. "I need this to work, sir. I've tried everything else." Marcus gestured for Chen to sit back down. "Tell me about your situation. 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq. IED took out my convoy 18 months ago. Lost my spotter, my driver, and my best friend. I came home with TBI, PTSD, and what the docs call survivor's guilt." Chen stared out the window at the ocean. "I've been through 3 different residential programs, tried every medication they've got, been to more therapists than I can count. Nothing works. What makes you think this place will be different?" Chen turned back to Marcus, and for the first time, his military composure cracked slightly. "Because you built something that matters. You didn't just get better, you made it possible for other people to get better. That's what I need, sir. I need to be part of something bigger than my own problems." Marcus understood completely. His own healing hadn't begun until he'd found purpose beyond personal recovery, until he'd discovered that his struggles could serve something larger than himself. The program is intensive, Marcus explained. 90 days minimum, with the possibility of extension if needed. You'll work 8 hours a day learning practical skills, spend 2 hours in individual or group therapy, and participate in community service projects that help maintain the lighthouse and support local families. And after the program, we help place graduates in jobs that use the skills they've learned here. We also maintain a support network of alumni who stay in touch, who help each other through difficult times, who come back to help train new participants. Chen nodded eagerly. When could I start? There's a waiting list. But Marcus paused, studying the young ranger's face. Something about Chen reminded him of his own desperation during those first months after his medical discharge. Let me talk to our intake coordinator. We might be able to work something out for next week. That afternoon, Marcus walked the lighthouse grounds with Dr. Foster, discussing the expansion plans that would allow them to help even more veterans. The success of the Keeper's Light program had attracted attention from the VA, from private donors, and from corporations looking to support veteran employment initiatives. The Ford Foundation wants to fund a satellite program in California, Dr. Foster reported. They're offering $2 million to establish a West Coast facility based on our model. What about the proposal from the Navy? They want to contract with us to provide transition services for sailors leaving the service. It would triple our budget and allow us to expand the residential capacity to 50 participants at a time. Marcus considered the opportunities and challenges of rapid growth. Success brought its own problems, the risk of losing the personal touch that made their program effective, the danger of becoming just another government contractor rather than a genuine community of healing. Let's move slowly, he decided. I'd rather help fewer people really well than help more people inadequately. That evening, Marcus attended the weekly group session that had become his favorite part of the program. 12 veterans sat in a circle in the lighthouse's 4th-floor therapy room, sharing their experiences and supporting each other through the difficult work of healing. Tonight's group included Maria Santos, an Air Force mechanic who'd lost both legs to a roadside bomb in Syria, James Thompson, a Marine sniper dealing with moral injury from things he'd been ordered to do in Iraq, and Robert Kim, a Navy corpsman struggling with addiction after using pain medication to cope with untreated PTSD. I've been thinking about what Marcus said last week, Maria was saying, about how the lighthouse was built to guide people through dangerous waters. That's kind of what we're doing here, isn't it? Learning to navigate safely through the dangerous parts of coming home. James nodded. I spent 3 years thinking my life was over, that the best parts of me died overseas. But working in the restoration shop, rebuilding that 1967 Mustang from the ground up, it's like rebuilding myself, one piece at a time. For me, it's the boat building, Robert added. Captain Murphy keeps saying that boats are only as strong as their weakest seam, that you have to pay attention to every joint, every connection. It makes me think about how I need to pay attention to every part of my recovery, not just the easy stuff. Marcus listened to the discussion with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose vision had become reality. These weren't just veterans getting therapy, they were people rebuilding their lives with purpose, community, and hope. Dr. Sarah Walsh, the program's lead psychologist, guided the conversation toward practical coping strategies and peer support techniques. Unlike the VA group sessions Marcus remembered from his own early recovery, these discussions felt natural, productive, focused on solutions rather than simply venting problems. "Marcus," Dr. Walsh said as the session concluded, "would you mind staying for a few minutes? I wanted to update you on David Chen's intake evaluation." After the other participants had left for evening recreation time, Dr. Walsh opened Chen's file. His psychological profile is concerning. Multiple suicide attempts, severe depression, what appears to be complex PTSD with dissociative episodes. Honestly, he might need more intensive treatment than we can provide here. Marcus thought about his conversation with Chen earlier, about the young ranger's desperate hope that Keeper's Light might succeed where other programs had failed. "What's your recommendation?" "Normally, I'd suggest inpatient psychiatric care before residential treatment. But his military records show exceptional leadership potential, and his skills assessment indicates he'd do well in our technical programs." Dr. Walsh closed the file. "If we accept him, we'd need to provide closer supervision and possibly one-on-one therapy sessions. Can we do that?" "We can try. But Marcus, you need to understand that some people can't be saved by work therapy and community support. Some wounds are too deep, some damage too extensive." Marcus nodded, but he also remembered his own darkest moments, the times when well-meaning professionals had written him off as too damaged for recovery. "Let's give him a chance. If anyone understands what it's like to feel hopeless, it's the people here." The next Monday, David Chen arrived with a single duffel bag and the hollow expression Marcus recognized from his own early days at the Lighthouse. Chen was assigned to the Automotive Restoration Program, working under the supervision of Master Sergeant, retired Carlos Rivera, a Vietnam veteran who'd spent 30 years teaching military mechanics before joining the Keeper's Light staff. "First thing you learn," Carlos told Chen as they stood before a completely disassembled 1971 Plymouth Barracuda, "is that everything broken can be fixed. Might take time, might take patience, might require completely rebuilding from the frame up. But if you're willing to do the work, you can make anything run again." Marcus watched from a distance as Chen began the slow process of learning to trust himself with complex tasks again. Brain injury had affected Chen's short-term memory and concentration, making him doubt his ability to handle detailed work. But under Carlos's patient guidance, Chen gradually rediscovered skills he'd thought were lost forever. The breakthrough came during Chen's third week, when he successfully rebuilt the Barracuda's carburetor without assistance. Marcus found him in the workshop that evening, long after the official workday had ended, just sitting beside the car and running his hands along the engine block. "It's weird," Chen said without looking up. "For the first time in almost 2 years, I completed something. I fixed something that was broken, and it actually works. How does that feel? Like maybe I'm not as broken as I thought I was." Chen finally looked at Marcus, and for the first time, his eyes held hope instead of desperation. "Like maybe there's still something useful left in me." Over the following months, Marcus watched Chen transform from a suicidal veteran, convinced he was worthless, into a confident technician who helped other participants with their projects. Chen's mechanical skills, combined with his natural leadership ability, made him invaluable as a peer mentor for newly arrived veterans. The transformation wasn't unique to Chen. Marcus saw it repeated with every group that completed the program. Broken people discovering they could fix things, isolated individuals finding community, hopeless veterans rebuilding their sense of purpose and self-worth. Jessica Martinez, a Marine Corps engineer who'd completed the program 6 months earlier, returned regularly to help with new participant orientation. She'd used skills learned at Keeper's Light to start her own construction company, specializing in accessible housing for disabled veterans. "Before I came here," she told new arrivals during orientation, "I thought my best days were behind me, that the war had taken everything I had to offer the world. Now I'm building homes for homeless veterans, employing other program graduates, and actually making money doing work I love." Thomas Patterson, an Army medic who'd struggled with addiction after being prescribed opioids for combat injuries, had parlayed his boat-building skills into a job with a Maine shipyard. He'd been clean for 8 months and was planning to marry his longtime girlfriend. "The thing about Keeper's Light," he explained to Marcus during one of his visits, "isn't just that you learn practical skills. It's that you remember who you were before everything went wrong. You remember that you're capable of building things, fixing things, helping people." But perhaps the most dramatic transformation Marcus witnessed was his own. Standing in the lighthouse's lantern room one evening, as sunset painted the Atlantic in shades of gold and crimson, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him from that first desperate dollar bid to this moment of quiet satisfaction. Below him, the lights of workshop buildings showed dozens of veterans learning trades that would support them for life. Beyond them, the ocean that had once seemed like an appropriate place to end his story now felt like a promise of endless possibility. The nightmares hadn't disappeared entirely, but they came rarely now, overwhelmed by the daily satisfaction of meaningful work. The hypervigilance that had made civilian life so difficult found productive outlet in managing complex programs and ensuring the safety of vulnerable people. The leadership skills he'd developed in the military had found new purpose in guiding fellow veterans through their own journeys of recovery. Most importantly, Marcus had discovered that survival wasn't enough. Recovery meant more than simply managing symptoms or avoiding self-destruction. True healing required finding ways to transform personal pain into purpose that served something larger than individual needs. The treasure that had started this journey, the pirate gold and emeralds that had attracted so much attention from government agents and private collectors, now served its intended purpose. William Morrison and his fellow pirates had hidden their wealth, hoping it might someday help men like themselves, warriors who'd served and sacrificed and been forgotten by the societies they'd protected. The legal battles had eventually resolved in Marcus's favor, thanks largely to community support and Dr. Foster's meticulous documentation. The state of Maine had recognized his ownership rights while establishing the lighthouse as a historic site. International claims from European governments had been settled through negotiated compensation that allowed the most significant artifacts to remain at Keeper's Light while acknowledging historical grievances. Even Jonathan Blackwood had eventually withdrawn his family's claims, faced with overwhelming evidence that his ancestor had been a common criminal with no legal authority for his activities. The Blackwood family's century-long intimidation campaign had crumbled when exposed to public scrutiny and community resistance. But the real victory wasn't legal or financial. It was the transformation of the lighthouse itself, from a monument to abandonment into a beacon of hope. The original Fresnel lens had been restored and now operated nightly, not to guide ships, but to symbolize the lighthouse's renewed purpose. Local fishermen had requested the restoration, saying it felt right to see the light burning again after so many dark years. "You know," Tom Bradshaw had said during the lighthouse's rededication ceremony, "this old tower's been standing here for over a century, keeping watch over dangerous waters. Now it's doing the same thing for different kinds of travelers, folks trying to navigate their way home from different kinds of storms." The ceremony had drawn veterans from across New England, families of program participants, local residents who'd supported the project from the beginning, and officials from organizations that had provided funding and expertise. But Marcus's favorite moment had come when David Chen, now serving as a peer counselor while completing his own recovery, had been chosen to relight the beacon. "This light represents hope," Chen had said as he activated the restored lens. "Not just for those of us who found healing here, but for every veteran still struggling, still searching for their way home. As long as this light burns, they'll know there's a place for them, a community that understands their struggles and believes in their potential." Now, 6 months later, that light burned every night, visible for miles along the Maine coast. It had become a landmark for more than navigation. It served as a symbol of recovery, community, and the belief that broken things could be made whole again. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Foster. "Documentary crew from PBS wants to schedule interviews for next month. Story will air as part of their series on innovative veteran programs." Marcus smiled, remembering his anxiety about media attention during the early days of his discovery. Now he welcomed opportunities to share the Keeper's Light story, understanding that visibility helped attract funding, volunteers, and veterans who needed to know that effective help was available. Another text arrived, this one from Jessica Martinez. "New company just landed contract to build transitional housing complex for homeless vets in Portland. Will employ 15 program graduates. Thanks for believing in us." Messages like these arrived, daily updates from program graduates who were building successful lives, requests from other communities wanting to establish similar programs, offers of support from corporations and foundations that had heard about Keeper's Light's success. But the message that meant the most came from David Chen. "Celebrating 1 year clean and sober today. Starting night classes next month to get my engineering degree. Couldn't have done any of this without the foundation I built at the Lighthouse. Thank you for saving my life." Marcus put his phone away and walked down to the restored Keeper's cottage, where evening recreation activities were winding down. Veterans who'd spent the day learning trades now relaxed together, playing cards, sharing stories, simply enjoying the kind of ordinary social interaction that many of them had lost during their struggles with trauma and isolation. In the automotive workshop, the 1971 Plymouth Barracuda that Chen had restored now served as a teaching tool for new participants. Its engine gleamed under the workshop lights, a testament to the idea that anything broken could be rebuilt with patience, skill, and community support. The boat-building workshop housed 3 projects in various stages of completion: a classic Maine lobster boat, a recreational sailboat, and a specialized fishing vessel designed for wheelchair accessibility. Each project taught different skills while serving practical purposes for the local community. The metalworking shop produced custom pieces that were sold to support the program: decorative ironwork, restored antique firearms, and precision tools that were prized by craftsmen throughout New England. Veterans learned that their work had value beyond therapy, that their skills could contribute to the broader economy. But the most important work happened in the quiet moments, conversations between participants who understood each other's struggles, the gradual rebuilding of self-confidence through successful completion of challenging tasks, the slow recognition that military skills and values could be translated into civilian success. Marcus climbed the spiral staircase to his apartment, pausing at each landing to check the dormitory floors where program participants lived during their residency. Quiet conversations drifted from common areas where veterans processed their experiences and supported each other through difficult transitions. From his apartment windows, Marcus could see the lights of Prospect Harbor, the community that had rallied to support his vision when powerful interests had tried to steal his discovery. The town had been transformed as much as the Lighthouse new businesses had opened to serve visitors. Local employment had increased, and property values had risen as people recognized the area's historical significance. But more than economic benefits, the Lighthouse had given Prospect Harbor something invaluable: proof that small communities could fight for their own interests, that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they worked together for common purposes. As Marcus prepared for sleep, he thought about the letter he'd received that morning from the widow of Thomas Morrison, the historian whose death had nearly derailed the entire project. "My husband would be so proud of what you've accomplished," she'd written. "He spent his life researching the pirates' treasure, but I think what you've built is the real treasure. A place where broken people can be made whole, where service members who've given everything for their country can find new purpose and community. Thank you for proving that his life's work served something greater than anyone imagined. The treasure was real, valuable beyond the dreams of the pirates who'd hidden it beneath Morrison Point. But the gold and emeralds had been transformed into something far more precious: hope for people who'd thought their best days were behind them, community for those who'd felt abandoned by the society they'd served, and proof that sometimes the most broken places hold the greatest gifts. Marcus Rivera had bought a lighthouse for $1, thinking he needed a place to disappear. Instead, he'd found a way to help dozens of fellow veterans reappear in their communities, in meaningful work, in lives rebuilt with purpose, and supported by people who understood their struggles. The lighthouse beam swept across the dark Atlantic, no longer warning ships away from dangerous rocks, but calling them home to safe harbor. And in the morning, new veterans would arrive, carrying their own wounds and hopes, ready to discover what Marcus had learned: that the most valuable treasures aren't gold or silver, but the opportunity to transform personal pain into purpose that serves something greater than individual need. Anyone can find treasure if they're brave enough to explore the darkness, wise enough to understand what's truly valuable, and generous enough to share their discovery with others who need hope. Because sometimes the richest treasures aren't the ones we find buried in the ground, but the ones we build with our own hands, one life at a time. As the stars emerged over Keeper's Light and the ocean whispered against the rocks below, Marcus Rivera slept peacefully, knowing that the best treasures aren't kept but given away, that the strongest lights are those that guide others safely home. Up next, 2 more incredible true stories that will restore your faith in second chances and remind you that heroism comes in many forms. Click to continue this amazing journey with us. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe the most valuable treasures are the ones we create by helping others heal.